He didn't just reject her, he banned her officially, formally, permanently. The President of the United States looked at the President of the European Commission, the woman who controls the economic future of 450 million people, the woman who commands a budget of $2 trillion, the woman who has survived every crisis, every scandal, and every political assault thrown at her for 5 consecutive years, and told her she was not welcome on American soil, not disinvited from a specific summit, not excluded from a particular meeting, banned, placed on a restricted access list that bars her from every official engagement with the American executive branch. No White House, no State Department, no bilateral forum where Trump or any member of his cabinet is present in an official capacity. And the reason behind that ban, the specific document that put it in motion, is something Brussels has been working around the clock to bury before the public understands what it actually says. Because when Trump read it, he did not call his advisors. He did not consult his diplomatic team. He picked up the phone and gave one instruction. And what von der Leyen did in response to that ban did not de-escalate the crisis. It detonated it. She threatened to collapse NATO. And the next 72 hours will determine whether the Western alliance that has kept the world from a third world war for 80 years survives what she just set in motion. The story does not begin with the ban. It begins 3 weeks before the ban, inside a room in Brussels that was never supposed to be discussed outside the walls of the European Council. A room with no press access, no public record, and no official minutes distributed to governments that were not represented at the table. A room where Ursula von der Leyen sat at the head of a table surrounded by her most senior commissioners and presented a document she called a strategic realignment package. The language was bureaucratic and deliberate. Bureaucratic language is how Brussels disguises intentions that cannot survive contact with plain description. The intention underneath the language was anything but bureaucratic. What von der Leyen laid out in that room was a coordinated economic assault on American technological dominance in European markets, targeted, sequenced, designed to cause maximum structural damage to American corporate revenue streams while maintaining enough diplomatic cover to avoid being described publicly as what it actually was. The plan targeted Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Meta simultaneously. Emergency tariffs totaling $87 billion would be imposed within 30 days of formal activation. But the tariffs were only the surface layer of what the document contained, because accompanying the tariff proposal was an internal memo marked confidential, distributed only to the most senior participants in that room, that revealed the true objective with a clarity that the public presentation deliberately obscured. The goal was not to generate revenue for European budgets. The goal was not to level a competitive playing field or address genuine regulatory concerns about market dominance. The goal was to force American technology companies to relocate their intellectual property, their operational infrastructure, and their European revenue streams into EU-controlled jurisdictions permanently and irreversibly. This was not regulation dressed in the language of digital sovereignty. This was economic annexation. And the memo said so in terms that left no room for alternative interpretation to anyone reading it seriously. Von der Leyen believed the plan was airtight in a way that reflected a fundamental miscalculation about the man she was targeting. She believed American companies were too deeply embedded in European markets to absorb the shock of full decoupling. She believed Trump would rage publicly, generate enormous noise, threaten consequences, and ultimately negotiate because American corporations with hundreds of billions in European revenue exposure would lobby him into a compromise that protected their market access. She believed she held every card that mattered. She was wrong about every single one of those calculations. The memo was leaked, not to journalists, not to opposition politicians, not through any of the channels that Brussels leaks normally travel before reaching public attention. It was leaked directly and deliberately to American intelligence. Within 48 hours of that Brussels meeting, a complete transcription of von der Leyen's confidential document was sitting on a desk inside the White House. Sources with direct knowledge of the sequence of events that followed have confirmed that Trump was briefed personally. He read the memo in its entirety. He read the section where von der Leyen's team described the plan as a mechanism specifically designed to break American technological hegemony in European markets. He read the internal projections showing expected revenue losses for American companies running into the hundreds of billions over a 5-year implementation period. And he read the line that made the decision for him before he had finished the page. The line where von der Leyen's team stated explicitly that Washington would have no viable retaliatory option because European consumer markets were too valuable for American corporations to abandon, regardless of the political pressure applied. Trump circled that line with a pen. Then he made his decision with the speed and finality of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of provocation to justify exactly this kind of response. No phone call to von der Leyen, no back-channel warning delivered through diplomatic intermediaries giving Brussels an opportunity to walk the plan back quietly before consequences arrived. No grace period, no warning shot. Trump called his Secretary of State and gave a single instruction in terms that required no elaboration and left no room for bureaucratic softening in implementation. Ursula von der Leyen is banned from the White House effective immediately. No exceptions, no timeline for review, no conditions under which the ban would be lifted or revisited. The diplomatic notice was released through official State Department channels on a Tuesday morning with the precise formal wording that official diplomatic notices use when they are designed to communicate permanence rather than open a negotiation. Von der Leyen was not merely excluded from a specific scheduled event. She was placed on a restricted access list that barred her from all official bilateral engagements with the American executive branch without exception. No White House meetings, no state dinners, no bilateral summits, no participation in any international forum where Trump or members of his cabinet would be present in an official capacity. For the President of the European Commission, the institution that represents the collective executive authority of 27 nations and 450 million citizens, this was not a scheduling inconvenience or a diplomatic slight to be managed through the usual channels of back-channel repair. It was a declaration. A formal, public, documented declaration that the United States of America no longer recognized Ursula von der Leyen as a legitimate counterpart in the relationship between the world's two largest economic powers. Trump made absolutely certain the message was understood at every level it needed to reach. He did not allow the diplomatic notice to speak for itself and be processed through the machinery of diplomatic interpretation that normally softens the impact of formal communications between allied governments. Hours after the notice was released, he stepped in front of cameras at Mar-a-Lago and said what no American president had ever said about a sitting European Commission president in the entire history of the transatlantic relationship. He said von der Leyen had declared economic war on American companies and American workers. He said her plan was not regulation, it was theft. He said America does not negotiate with economic extortionists. And then he looked directly into the camera and delivered the line that sent shockwaves through every foreign ministry in Europe simultaneously. He said the era of America subsidizing European arrogance is finished. The reaction inside the Berlaymont building was immediate, total, and catastrophic in ways that the official response released 12 minutes later was specifically designed to conceal from public view. Von der Leyen's communications team had exactly 12 minutes of warning before the Mar-a-Lago press conference went live. They spent those 12 minutes producing a statement that was diplomatically measured, institutionally composed, and calibrated to project the appearance of calm authority over a situation that inside those walls was producing anything but calm. The statement spoke of the enduring importance of transatlantic partnership, the mutual benefits of EU-US economic cooperation, and the Commission's commitment to constructive dialogue on all matters of shared concern. It was a perfectly constructed piece of institutional damage control. It fooled nobody who was watching what was actually happening, because while the official statement was being distributed to press agencies, a completely different conversation was consuming every senior official inside that building. Von der Leyen's inner circle had already grasped what the public statement was designed to obscure from the broader European political environment for as long as possible. The ban was not a negotiating tactic. It was not a pressure move designed to bring Brussels back to the table on terms Washington preferred. It was a termination. Trump had made a decision that von der Leyen was not a partner to be engaged or even a serious adversary to be confronted. She was a problem to be isolated until the isolation itself produced the political consequences inside Europe that Washington preferred to see. An isolation for a commission president whose entire institutional authority rests on her ability to represent Europe in global power negotiations was not just a diplomatic embarrassment. It was an existential threat to the political foundation of everything she had built. Senior officials present in that building that evening described the internal atmosphere in terms that had no precedent in their combined decades of Brussels experience. People who had navigated the 2008 financial crisis, the Brexit negotiations, and the COVID emergency summits with professional composure were visibly shaken, not because of the ban itself, because of what they could see coming from it with a clarity that the official statement was buying time to prevent becoming public. If von der Leyen could not enter the White House, she could not negotiate the tariff dispute through the direct channel that the scale of the confrontation required. If she could not negotiate directly, the $87 billion package would advance on its original timeline without the diplomatic pressure release that bilateral engagement would have provided. If the package advanced, American retaliation was not a possibility to be modeled and prepared for. It was a certainty. An American retaliation against European exports arriving simultaneously with the internal political instability that the ban had already triggered across European capitals would push the European economy into territory that finance ministers were privately discussing in terms they refused to use in any public forum. The markets did not wait for finance ministers to find their public language. The euro dropped against the dollar within hours of the Mar-a-Lago press conference landing on trading terminals. European technology stocks began a selling spiral as institutional investors updated risk models to account for what was now, for the first time, a genuine probability rather than a theoretical scenario. Bond yields in southern European nations moved upward as sovereign debt investors began pricing in the political instability at commission level that the ban had made impossible to ignore. Everything was accelerating simultaneously, and von der Leyen had not yet made her countermove, but she was already deciding what it would be. And what she decided in the next 24 hours did not slow the acceleration. It removed every remaining brake on the crisis entirely, because the move she chose was not the move of a leader managing consequences. It was the move of a leader who had decided that the only way to survive what was coming was to make what was coming so catastrophic for everyone that walking it back became the only rational option for all sides. She was wrong about that calculation too. And the moment she made it, NATO entered the crisis in a way that none of the alliance's 80 years of institutional history had ever prepared it to manage. So what exactly did she threaten? And why did the 6 hours of silence from Washington that followed her announcement terrify Brussels more than any aggressive response ever could have? The announcement came at 11 a.m. Brussels time the following morning. Von der Leyen called an emergency press conference and stood before cameras with the specific kind of controlled composure that only someone who is fully committed to a catastrophic gamble can project. The composure of someone who has passed the point of second guessing and crossed into the territory where the only available direction is forward, regardless of what forward contains. She announced that the European Commission was formally initiating a comprehensive review of all existing defense cooperation frameworks between the European Union and the United States. She used careful language. She spoke of strategic autonomy. She referenced Europe's need to develop independent defense capabilities adequate to the security environment of the 21st century. She framed every element of the announcement in the vocabulary of sovereignty and self-determination that European audiences had been conditioned to receive as reasonable and even admirable expressions of European confidence. But the message underneath the diplomatic vocabulary was not reasonable and was not admirable and was not the expression of European confidence. It was a threat. The most dangerous threat that any European leader had ever delivered to an American president in the entire post-war history of the transatlantic alliance. She was pointing directly at NATO. She was telling Trump that if he did not lift the ban, if he did not return to the negotiating table on terms that restored her standing as a legitimate counterpart, she would begin the process of dismantling the architecture of transatlantic military cooperation that had kept Europe secure for 80 years and had kept American strategic interests anchored in the European continent for the same period. She was not threatening a trade adjustment or a regulatory response or any of the economic instruments that transatlantic disputes normally involve. She was threatening the foundational military structure of the entire Western world. And she was doing it because she had calculated that the institutional panic this threat would produce in Washington would force the kind of rapid de-escalation that economic pressure alone had failed to generate. The calculation was wrong in a way that revealed how completely she had misread the specific president she was dealing with. She expected alarm from Washington within hours of the announcement. She expected back-channel calls from American national security officials urging de-escalation through diplomatic language designed to give both sides a face-saving path back from the edge. She expected the kind of institutional panic that had always in previous administrations forced Washington to soften its position when European leaders pushed back with sufficient force on questions touching American strategic interests. She had seen it work before. She had seen American administrations retreat from confrontational positions when European unity signaled that the cost of the confrontation was becoming too high. What she had not seen, and what her entire strategic framework failed to account for, was a president for whom the institutional consequences that constrained previous American administrations were not constraints at all. Trump said nothing for 6 hours. That silence was not the silence of an administration processing an unexpected development and formulating a careful response. It was the silence of a president who had read the threat, assessed it, and decided that the correct response was to demonstrate that the threat was not a threat at all, that it was an invitation. 6 hours after von der Leyen's press conference, Trump did not issue a diplomatic statement. He did not respond through back channels. He did not send his Secretary of State to a microphone to deliver a measured response calibrated to leave room for negotiation. He walked into a press briefing at the Pentagon. He stood next to his defense secretary, and he announced that the United States was immediately accelerating a previously scheduled review of American force deployments across the European continent. He said American taxpayers had been subsidizing European defense for decades while European governments spent their money on regulatory bureaucracies and social programs that served European political classes rather than European security. He said any nation or